So this is the fourth lecture in the series. We had one on Malaysia, one on the German electoral system, and one on electoral systems in general, with all these different types of, but especially in Southeast and East Asia. So, yeah, I would now talk about presidential elections in Indonesia and the Philippines, and especially its effects on the party system, I think. But maybe there are some more general effects. I mean, what does it mean if you elect the president directly for a polity, for a party system? So I would like, oops, I'm now not able, yeah. I would like to begin with a very short definition of presidentialism. I will shortly talk about the perils of presidentialism according to Juan Linz. There's a long debate in political science about what presidentialism means. Is it good or is it bad for the polity in general? Then shortly on the electoral system in Indonesia and the presidentialization of politics. Yeah, presidentialization means that the introduction of a presidential system alters policies and politics, and this is called presidentialization. The same in the Philippines, and then I will try to come up with some conclusions. So there are well, different types of political systems, and in presidential systems, the main characteristic, the main feature is that the president is elected directly by the people. In Germany, you also have a president, but he's not, or she is not elected by the people, but by a specific, well, chamber, the Bundesversammlung. And it's not a presidential system because the president actually is not really powerful. It's all about the chancellor. So in many countries, there is a president, but he or she is not elected by the people, like in Germany, Greece, Hungary, India, and so on. But at least according to André Blais, Massicot, there are 33 countries where the president is elected directly by the people, or no, in 32 of these 33 countries, the president is elected by the people, and in 32 he or she is directly elected. And there's one country, the US, where there is this electoral college. So usually you would think it's not very important whether there is an electoral college in between. But in the last elections with Trump, it was, I think, very important because at that time, people discussed about the question whether the members of the Electoral College would really vote for the person they were supposed to vote for. Yeah, in some states, maybe Biden had a majority, and then usually the members of the Electoral College would vote for Biden. But at that time, there were rumors that some of them would nevertheless vote for Trump. That was obviously possible, but at the end they did not do it. So usually the president is directly elected by the people. And then there are different systems, a plurality system, for example, that means just a majority is enough. Like in the Philippines, you can become president in the Philippines with maybe only 30%. And then usually you have a majority vote with a runoff election, like in Indonesia. But the last time you only had two candidates, so it was only one round. So, and then there's of course the distinction between not only a parliamentary system and presidentialism, but in between, in semi-presidential systems, you have a double executive. Yeah, you have a prime minister and a president, and they are both quite powerful. If the president is more powerful than the prime minister, then it's a president parliamentarism system. If the prime minister is maybe more important, more powerful than the president, then it's premier presidentialism. But this is not so important now for us. I think semi-presidential systems are in East Timor, for example, but in East Timor, I think the president is not that powerful. He was powerful at the beginning because he was so famous, yeah? And because of that, with his charisma, he was very influential. But according to the constitution, it's more the prime minister. And then you have South Korea and Taiwan countries. So what are the perils of presidentialism? I'm referring to Juan Linz, and Juan Linz was writing in the Journal of Democracy in the 1990s, and he thinks that in presidential systems, and he was thinking of Latin America and the US, I think, yeah, because Juan Linz is a Latin America expert and was living in the US. So according to him, very often, of course not always, direct elections of the president produce very powerful people at the top. And because they are so powerful, they tend to abuse power. So that's called presidential aggrandizement. That's the first peril of presidentialism. Then the focus on presidential candidates often leads to political parties with shallow platforms. Yeah, everybody is focusing on the presidential candidates, and the political parties are somehow marginalized, especially in the US. Yeah. From a European perspective, the Democrats and the Republicans are not really political parties, more presidential platforms, something like that. And the question is, if you introduce a presidential system, will this peril of presidentialism will be valid in these countries like Indonesia? And then weak parties and personalism enhance the rise of populism. That's the third peril, according to Juan Linz. And he again was thinking of Latin America, where there was a wave of populism already under Perón in the 1950s, and then again and again, new waves of populism. Yeah, you have weak parties. Everybody is focusing on presidential candidates, and that means populist campaigns are quite typical for these systems. So now I begin to use this. So I don't want to talk a lot about the constitutional reforms in Indonesia. Usually I do that, but you are all Indonesians, so you know that from 1999 until 2004, mayors, bupatis, and so on were elected indirectly. You had a proportional representation electoral system with closed list. What else? The president was, of course, not elected directly. It was Abdurrahman Wahid at that time, 1999, and then Megawati. And because Abdurrahman Wahid was not elected directly, it was a kind of strange hybrid. It was not a real presidential system. Some would even say it was more like a parliamentary system, yeah, because, well, the president was dependent on the support by the parliament, by the MPR every year, yeah, at that time. And, well, that's more like a parliamentary system, but everybody was thinking, well, it's actually a presidentialist system. And I think also Abdurrahman Wahid thought that he's a president with all the powers a president usually has. But it was not really. It was one of the very few systems with, well, strange qualities according to the usual differentiation. But since 2004, you have this proportional representation with open list, fully implemented in 2014, and then the direct elections of all local leaders and president, vice president. And that means Indonesia is one of the few cases where you had a transformation from strange hybrid or more kind of parliamentary system to full presidentialism. And that is very interesting to political scientists, because then you can see, like in a lab, what happens if you switch some of the electoral regulations. So we just, or we had talked a little bit about what happened in Indonesia actually. Why was there a proportional representation? Why not a plurality system or something like that? And if you read, for example, Horowitz or some others, you can see that there's a long-standing debate in Indonesia on what kind of electoral system to introduce. In the mid-1990s already, Suharto asked Lippi to come forward with some proposal, and that time Lippi proposed first past the post, like in Malaysia. Yeah, so I will skip this. Then in 1998, Habibie also asked for ideas, and Lippi at that time suggested a list PR system. But then there was the team Tuju, a team of experts advising Habibie at that time, most of them US trained, many from NIU, from Northern Illinois University, Andi Malarangeng, Rias Rashid, Ramlan Sobakri, Afan Gaffa, and then, well, this so-called mafia, Northern Illinois mafia, also proposed first past the post, maybe because they were thinking in terms of American political science. But at the end, they did not introduce first past the post, although Golkar was very eager to do that, because Golkar obviously would have had many advantages. All the small parties would lose out, and Golkar and 2-3 other parties would have won. But in 1998, 99, before the elections, there was a tussle in the parliament. It was still the old parliament, the old New Order MPs were still debating electoral reforms, but outside of parliaments, there were the reformers who expected something else. And then at the end, they came up with proportional representation. And as you know, in 1999, they did not have a threshold, for example. So they had many, many parties. And because of that, because of this fragmentation of the party system, they not only introduced the threshold, I think it's now 4%, but they also changed the magnitude of constituencies. But this is not the subject of me today. So you had always since the 90s and before a list PR system in Indonesia, proportional representation. The legislative size has, of course, changed a few times, now 575. Well, but that's what all of you know. So the question for me is always, what does that mean for political parties? So if you look at the evolution of political parties and the party system in Indonesia, I would say that in the 1950s, you had a multi-party system, and the political parties were rooted in socio-cultural streams or aliran. So Masyumi and NU and the PKI and PNI were well rooted in their own social milieus. There were many organizations linked to these parties, and it was a bit European-like, you could say. Political parties were not just elitist, but well, they had not members like in European parties, but at least there were close linkages to huge parts of the population. The political parties' platforms were not shallow at that time because NU, Masyumi, especially PKI and PNI stood for specific policies and stood for specific outlooks on politics in general. They even maybe did want to introduce different political systems like the PKI. So, but what happened after the New Order when democratization started in 1998? There was this long period of authoritarianism since 1957 until 1998, and political parties were, of course, not really influential during these 4 decades. But then in 1998, Indonesians were allowed to establish many, many different parties. And in 1999, many people thought it's a bit like in the 1950s. You still had the same social milieus, and you had the PDIP as a successor of PNI, and some Muslim parties as successors of NU and Masyumi. Okay, no PKI, but some other parties. So still somehow rooted in social milieus. But I would say this again has changed after the introduction of presidentialism, because well, you have these parties that serve mostly as vehicles for presidential candidates like Hanura Gerindra, Demokrat, Partai Nasdem, and so on. These people were founded because they want to promote specific people who would become then president or vice president. And these parties were not rooted in these old social milieus. They were not aliran-based, you would say, highly personalized ad hoc organizations, and financially dependent on, well, on some individuals, usually, like Prabowo or Prabowo's brother, or like some media moguls who established these parties. So since the introduction of presidentialization, of presidentialism, full presidentialism in 2004, you have a bifurcation of the party system. Some vehicle parties and then the old, more rooted political parties. Politics is more commercialized, I would say, because it's very costly to organize presidential campaigns and parliamentary campaigns. And that again strengthens the people who are behind the political parties and give the money. But you also have some mechanisms that lead to a moderation of politics, because you have a split ticket. That means maybe one Javanese candidate and the vice candidate is from the outer islands. One is more religious, the other less religious. You have to build pre-electoral coalitions with many different parties. All these things moderate inter-party competition and, well, have an effect on politics in general. But I think I will talk about this a bit later. I would now come to the Philippines. In the Philippines, you have, well, also full presidentialism because the president is directly elected in one round. But you also have a parliament. I think, did we already talk about parliamentary elections in the Philippines or the electoral system? I'm not quite sure. It's a mixed system because in parliament, some MPs are elected via a so-called party list. I will explain that later. And the others are elected like, well, in normal parliamentary system. This is called a parallel system because you have two different elements that leads to the election of MPs. So I think I will come to that in a minute. So this is the evolution of political parties in the Philippines. I don't want to explain that in detail. I think it's by Julio T. Henke. It's a lot of work to come up with this kind of overview. But most important is that political parties were established before independence at the beginning of the 20th century, but these parties were elitist parties because at that time there were no real elections, or elections only where a small part of the population could take part, only a percent of the population or two. So these political parties were totally dominated by a few people. And then with democratization in the 1940s, 1946, a kind of two-party system evolved from 1946 until 1972. And these two parties were not very much different from another. You had the Nacionalista Party and the Liberal Party, and sometimes politicians would switch from one party to the other and switch back, and the political platforms were more or less the same. So the Philippines copied to an extent the American system because there was American colonialism, but it was not a two-party system like in the US, where Democrats and Republicans are actually very different. And have always been, but in the Philippines, it's more or less the same. That means parties are not, or have not been, very meaningful in the Philippines. But after re-democratization, after Marcos from 72 until 86, a multi-party system came up in the Philippines. This is quite strange because to political scientists who focus on the US, it's quite normal that you have a two-party system with a majoritarian electoral system. And that was the case from 1946 until 72. But after 86, many different parties evolved. And until now, you have a multi-party system. And the question is, how could that be? There are different explanations for that. I will come to that later. Why are there now many parties and in the 50s and 60s only two? So I just told you there were elections in the Philippines before independence, starting in 1901. But for example, in 1907, only 1.15% of the total population was registered as voters. So it was a very small elite that was building political parties and that was able to participate in elections as voters. And that meant that in the Philippines, from the very beginning, political parties were dominated by these provincial families or clans, these leading 50 or 100 families in the Philippines. And these parties did not really have a platform. It was only built in order to get the spoils of office. So these parties were clan-based, ideologically indistinct, and this is the case until today. And this is the major difference to Indonesia. In Indonesia, political parties were also built before independence, but these political parties were anti-colonial parties because there were no elections. They were rather anti-colonial, well, platforms with masses of supporters. I mean, NU was not a political party from the beginning. It was religious organizations, but with hundreds of thousands who supported NU, and then NU became a political party. That means it was a mass party with a clear ideological profile from the beginning. And the same is true of Masyumi. Masyumi was, well, assembled in a way by the Japanese, but of course Muhammadiyah was at the beginning a kind of predecessor, you could say, as a social movement that became a party. Again, it was to an extent anti-colonial, but had a mass base from the beginning. And the other example is, of course, the PKI, that was, of course, anti-colonial, but also the PNI under Sukarno in the 1930s, for example. So anti-colonial or mass movement parties that stood at the beginning of party and party system evolution in Indonesia until today. And in the Philippines, as I said, totally different, clan-based, ideologically indistinct elite parties. Two-party system until 72. And now multi-partyism since 1986. And why is that? There are different theories. There's an article by Choi who said that multi-partyism could be a result of a presidential term limit, because you can be a president in the Philippines only for one term for 6 years. And if you build a vehicle party, you may become president, but then the party is dissolved afterwards because the president cannot be re-elected. Yeah, that at least has happened many times. Yeah, they build parties and then they lose the elections, the party is dissolved, or they have one term and then the party again is dissolved and many new parties are established. But this is only part of the explanation. Then there are articles that would say that in the 1950s and 60s at the local level, there were always two different factions. Yeah. And because there were two factions, you would have usually two different candidates and then two different parties. And that this pattern was replicated at all levels of government. And now the social structure is more complex. You don't have only two factions at the different levels, but many different factions, elite factions, of course. And because of that, you have many different parties. And then the third explanation would be that under Marcos, under Ferdinand Marcos in the 1970s, 80s, different parties came up. Marcos initiated some experiments with restricted elections, and then a, well, strengthened opposition of political parties came up, and all this led to fragmentation of the party system in the 1980s. So the president, as I said, in the Philippines is elected for only one term, that's 6 years. That means that Duterte has to leave office next year. And at GIGA, we had a research project on presidential term limits, specifically on Latin America. And there is a special issue in democratization now on this. Yeah, it's very important whether a president can be elected for only one term or for 2 terms, like in Indonesia. It changes a lot with respect to the party system, but with respect to almost everything. If you have 2 terms, you during the first term try everything you can do to be re-elected, and that has a major impact on your policies in general. And well, this is what the research project has been about. Another difference between Indonesia and the Philippines is that in the Philippines you have a Senate, and the people of the Senate are, like in the US, elected directly in a plurality vote. And well, the Senate is much more powerful than the DPD in Indonesia. The DPD is almost powerless, I would say, but the Senate is really important. And then you have the House of Representatives. And as I said, you have a parallel system. 245 members are elected by plurality vote in single member constituencies, a typical first past the post system. And then you also have 59 members who are elected through proportional representation. But the specific thing is these 59 members are not elected as members of parties, but as well certain social organizations. And they have introduced that because they thought we could have the best of both worlds. The plurality vote, that means you have really a direct connection between MPs and the constituency, and also a little bit, at least, of the proportional system. But I think it does not really work, because the 59 members of the party list are insignificant, or it does not really add to representing those people who are usually marginalized in these systems. So you see, in the last Senate elections, for example, there were different parties, PDP, Laban, Nacionalista Party, UNA, and so on. These parties do usually not stand for specific policies. It's totally unlike Indonesia. In Indonesia, you know what you get, more or less. And the Muslim parties, of course, different from a more secular party and so on. But here these terms like Lakas, CMD, PDP, Laban do not tell us a lot. So there are many, many different parties, but it's mostly about personality. You vote for the senator. And if you ask Filipinos to which party does this senator belong, they usually would not know. So it's a plurality vote. That means those 12 candidates who get most of the votes are elected directly. So you could become a senator with only a few percent of the vote. And most of these people belong to the leading families of the Philippines, the clans that are well known, or they are TV personalities, for example. So this is very important in Indonesia. You are very well known because you are on TV, or you are boxing like Manny Pacquiao, or you belong to one of the leading families. Here, for example, Ime Marcos is, I think it's the daughter of Ferdinand Marcos. And well, there are some others. Grace Poe, there was one presidential candidate, Poe, a few years ago. So these are the different parties. I will not talk about that. I cannot see the whole slide. Yeah, these are the 304 members of the current House of Representatives. It's, well, it's not very transparent what that means. Yeah, you have so many different parties and party list groups. And as I said, most Filipinos will not be able to tell you which politician belongs to which party. Yeah, but this is also very different from the 1950s and 60s when you had only 2 parties. Now it's very much fragmented. And at the same time, these parties are not well rooted and they do not have really political platforms. So the question is this a result of presidentialism, or is this a result of the parallel system? To an extent, of course. But maybe we can talk about that later. So in these party list elections, these 59 people, it's not about political parties, but it's about different groups who represent usually those people who are to an extent marginalized. So you have groups like the anti-crime and terrorism community involvement and support, or you have a organization of teachers, or a group representing women like Gabriela, or you have some communist or groups close to communists like Bayan Muna. And then you have people close to Duterte. So the Duterte people established some groups that would get some of the seats in parliament, but actually they are supporters of Duterte. So you can get, I think, only 3 seats with one of these groups, and then at the end you have many different groups who are via the party list in parliament, and for voters is of course very intransparent and very complex. And most of these parties are now built by one of these elite groups, and they do not really represent the marginalized sector as was aimed at the beginning. So I would say that the party list system does not really work in the Philippines. So these are the presidents since 1986, and well, you see that much more like in Indonesia, these clans and families are so dominant that, for example, the president in 2010, Benigno Noynoy Aquino, was elected because he was the son of Corazon Aquino, and the reputation and the networks to become president. Or Gloria Macapagal Arroyo is the daughter of a former president of the Philippines. And Joseph Estrada was impeached more or less at the same time like Abdurrahman Wahid, 2001. And well, the sons and daughters of Estrada are still influential in politics. Also the sons and daughters of Marcos. Duterte is a bit different because the Duterte family did not belong to the clans or networks who are very powerful in Manila. Duterte came from the southern part of the Philippines, but at least the Duterte families is dominating in Davao and in Mindanao. You know? And well, we could now talk about populism in the Philippines. Who was a populist of these people? Most political scientists would say that Rodrigo Duterte is a typical populist because he constructed a moral antagonism between good and evil. And well, the symbols of evil were so-called drug personalities, and he was talking about an imminent disaster if he does not fight the drug personalities, the whole country will end in a catastrophe, something like that. That's the core of the populist discourse. I think Aquino was not a populist. Arroyo was also not. Joseph Estrada, many would say, was a populist because he represented himself as a person who stands for the poor people in the Philippines against the elites. But it was not really a moral antagonism. So Joseph Estrada only to an extent. But maybe one could say that in the Philippines, populism is on the rise, especially with respect to Duterte. So, okay, these were the candidates for the presidential elections, but I will not talk about that. Maybe it's mostly a political campaign focusing on these presidential candidates, and the political parties play a somewhat supporting role, but I would say much less so than in Indonesia. And then Julio Tihanki has written a lot about the impact of political clans or dynasties or families. This is much more important than in Indonesia. Indonesia, only to a certain extent. In the Philippines, most of the people who are elected into parliament are members of these so-called political clans. So in the 18th Congress, out of 245, 175 came from political clans, from the leading families. That means also at the local level, the mayors and so on are almost always from the same families. So this is totally different from Indonesia, and well, this is one of the main weaknesses of Philippine democracy, I would say. So if we compare, these are the last two slides. Do I still have a bit time, Ridho? I think so. I will need a few minutes. So if you compare party system evolution in Indonesia and the Philippines, you had nationalist, anti-colonial parties before independence in Indonesia. Major social organizations like NU and Muhammadiyah and so on were nuclei, were cores of political parties. And these political parties were not controlled by oligarchies. Yeah? You could even say that, well, there was no real bourgeoisie at that time in Indonesia. You had small landholders mostly, yeah, no people who would own a lot of land. And then in the 1950s, you had a multi-party system with socially rooted parties. Money politics was at that time not very influential. I think political parties in the 1950s were, well, maybe not poor, but the linkage between well, the evolving bourgeoisie and the political parties was a bit loose, I would say. Yeah. And then after Suharto, you had still the socially rooted parties, but less rooted than the 1950s. The links to the aliran were not that strong like in the 1950s. And then with presidentialism, you have the phenomenon that so-called vehicle parties have been established, like Hanura, Gerindra, Nasdem, and so on, so that you now have a very fragmented party system. Some of them are presidentialized. That means they are organized according to the logic of presidentialism. Some are not very much presidentialized because they are still rooted in social milieus. Yeah? But you have a growing impact of money and of money politics, because political campaigns are nowadays very expensive, in contrast to the 1950s, for example. And if you need much money and you don't have state subsidies, it means you need people who, well, function as financiers in the background of these political parties. And that usually means peoples are inside less democratic than they should be. But well, it's still much better, I would say, than in the Philippines, because in the Philippines, elitist parties have been established under colonial rule, because there were restricted elections first, because there were already oligarchies. You had a kind of bourgeoisie in the Philippines before independence, very rich people who controlled almost everything. Then in the 1950s, you had a two-party system, Liberal Party, Nacionalista Party, very elitist. I mean, still today, political parties in the Philippines are dominated by a few people at the top, and often they do not really have party congresses or something like that. Yeah? They don't have this apparatus like Indonesian parties. So in the 1950s, two-party system, elitist, a lot of money politics. And then after Marcos, you had a multi-party system, but still elitist presidential vehicles, usually as political parties, and money politics plays a very big role in the Philippines. So these are the main difference between Indonesia and the Philippines, and you can explain the differences with reference to the history of the party system. I think you really have to go back to the 1920s and 30s to understand why are political parties organized as they are today. Yeah? And then if you compare the effects of presidentialism in the two countries, well, in Indonesia, you have, I think, with the introduction of direct presidential elections in 2004, a rise of campaign expenses and strengthened business people within political parties. As I said, political parties are in general more de-aligned from their grassroots. There's a tendency towards more elitist parties, not well-rooted. There's a tendency within parties and within politics in general of a personalization. That means individual people are nowadays more important than political parties and platforms. There's a rise of outsiders. That's maybe not so bad. I mean, Jokowi was an outsider who came from Solo, and then without help by these old networks, he was able to enter the presidential palace in 2014. So rise of outsiders, and voters are increasingly interested in personality traits of politicians. Maybe not so much in political parties, but they focus on Prabowo and Jokowi and what are they standing for, these different people. Personalization of politics. We have a rise of populism. I think this comes almost automatically. If you focus on persons, then these persons have to find a narrative. They have to construct some antagonisms. They have to construct a difference to the other candidates. And well, because of the global wave of populism, this is also the case in Indonesia. And it is less, or it would less be the case if Indonesia would have a parliamentary system. If you would have a parliamentary system, you would have still these different parties, and then you would focus more on the platforms of political parties. It would be more about maybe specific policies, and at the same time these parties would have to build coalitions, I think you wouldn't have this rise of populism. And also, because of populism, because of personalization, there's an intensified polarization all over Indonesia, also involving the civil society. Yeah. So I would say in a parliamentary system, you have different parties, they stand for different policies. This could also lead to polarization, but this is moderated to an extent. And the parties represent voters within civil society. So there is a direct kind of representation. But in Indonesia, the political parties are nowadays very weak. Everybody is concentrating on personalities and on a populist narrative. And because the political parties are not able to really represent civil society groups or social groups in general, there's a mismatch, I would say. And that leads to polarization within civil society. Yeah, like in the in the case of the governor elections and everything that surrounded the governor elections in Jakarta, with the different candidates. So a strong polarization within civil society. And in the Philippines, it's not clear because there was always a presidential system. Yeah. Are these weaknesses of Philippine democracy a result of presidentialism, or, well, we do not really know in contrast to Indonesia, because parties have always been de-aligned in the Philippines from the beginning. Is there a rise of campaign costs in the Philippines? It's not quite clear, but if you read about presidential elections in 1965 and 69, the campaigns were extremely expensive at that time, especially in 1969 when Marcos again won in free and fair election, not really free and fair election, mostly free and fair election. He used so much money that it was a substantial part of the national budget that was expended at that time. So one of the most costly elections in Philippine history. So campaign costs were always high in the Philippines. There was always a dominance of clans or families, still the old families, like in the beginning of the 20th century. The president in the Philippines is, I would say, stronger than the president in Indonesia, because the House of Representatives and the parties within the House are weaker. That also has to do with the power of the president to use a lot of money, to build linkages to members of parliament. Usually most members of parliament immediately after the election switch to the camp of the president and support him or her directly. Usually I would say this is totally different from Indonesia, but in Indonesia you also have a tendency, to build a kind of cartel, and that almost every party supports the president. It's maybe a bit like in the Philippines, I wouldn't know. Is populism rising? Well, maybe. Yeah, Duterte is maybe a new type of politician. I think at least he's much more populist than people like Fernando Po or Estrada. So the presidentialism in the Philippines is very much personalized and clan-based with very weak parties. And that's another difference to Indonesia. But I think in 2006, I wrote a working paper about the Filipinization of politics in Indonesia, because at that time I thought Indonesia will not become exactly like the Philippines, of course not, but that some of the characteristics of the Philippine presidential system will be also characteristic for Indonesia after many years. And I think to an extent, there is really a Filipinization. There's more populism in Indonesia, a bit like in the Philippines. Personalities are more important, maybe also TV personalities, something like that. Maybe there is a tendency to build clans or political families, but not really, only, well, to a certain extent. And yeah, I expected that parties would be more de-aligned, would become weaker like in the Philippines because of presidentialism. And this, I think, is really the case. Parties are now weaker than before 2004. But that's it. I think that's all for now.
Okay. Thank you, Andreas. So it's really interesting explanations, yeah, about the comparison of the presidentialism system between Indonesia and the Philippines. Yeah, when I heard your explanation that actually the presidentialism system has a weak effects, yeah, on the existence of political parties, yeah. The rise of business people, clan, and then what else you said in your presentation, money politics. So how do you think, yeah, before I ask to the audience, how do you think about the faith of, I mean, I don't know, yeah, how to make that presidentialism system is compatible with the party institutionalization, and also how to strengthen the democratic consolidation, because when we heard your explanation on the Philippine and Indonesian experience, everything is so far from the consolidated democracy values, I think. I don't know. How do you think about that? And the specific question is related, is money politics is rampant in most presidentialism system? I don't know. How do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, whether money politics is rampant, especially in presidential systems, I would not really know. Yeah, but if you look at the US, I mean, the US electoral campaigns are extremely expensive.
Okay.
And is it because of the presidential system? Yeah, I think so. If the US would have a multi-party system and a parliamentary system, I would think that political parties would maybe not spend so much money, because it's more on policies and platforms and not so much on this specific form of campaigning. And I'm thinking about European parties, and in Europe you usually have a parliamentary system, but
is money politics also take place in European? No, yeah.
Of course, there is money. It's always money politics and everywhere, but I mean, not that much.
I mean, the party or the candidate spend the cash to the voters. Is that happens?
I will talk about that in 2 weeks, but okay. I would say no. In Germany, of course, you cannot buy votes, but this is not because it's a parliamentary system. I think Germany would have direct presidential. I mean, it's even more difficult to buy votes in a presidential system because you cannot buy 20 million votes. So vote buying only works, I think, at lower levels. If you want to become the mayor, and you buy 3,000 votes, and because of that you win the elections. But in presidential elections, it's, I think, quite difficult. And I don't think that, well, about the Philippines, Duterte has not won because of vote buying, but When I say money politics, it encompasses many different things. Yeah, vote buying, yes, but also that business people or very rich people dominate political parties. That, of course, does not happen in Germany, for example. But there are other cases. In Switzerland, for example, there's a billionaire who has his only party and dominates this party very much. And in Eastern Europe, there are some cases like that. But usually not. I think in the old Western Europe, parliamentary democracies, business people are not that influential, but also because there are a lot of regulations that really work. So I'm not sure whether there's a direct relationship between different forms of money politics and presidentialism. I would tend to say yes, rather. There's rather more money politics in presidential systems because you have two elections. And that means you have to spend more money. And if you want to become president, you need a real big machinery. You need spin doctors. You need thousands of people who support you. You need a media campaign that is very sophisticated. That costs a lot of money. I think in the US, we're talking about billions of dollars. And in the Philippines, as I said, the 1960s with Marcos, I think it was, if you count money spent per vote, it was maybe even more expensive than in the US at that time. It was, devastating. And that, of course, also undermines democracy or democratic consolidation. But with respect to party institutionalization, well, the US example shows that political parties are often very weak in presidential systems. That's at least the case in the US. But the question then would be, how did the party system evolve in the US? You have to go back to the 18th or 19th century and then trace political developments. Maybe the parties are so weak in the US because of other reasons. Maybe it's not because of presidentialism. I mean, to come up with really causal relations is always very difficult. Like in the Philippines, it's not clear whether some characteristics of the political systems are the result of the presidential system. Sometimes maybe, but that's good about Indonesia. In Indonesia, you switched to a presidential system, and because of that, causal relationships, at least certain causal relationships, are at least more probable. So the rise of vehicle parties, of parties used only as vehicles to become president. I think this is a direct result of the introduction of direct presidential elections.
Only as a vehicle,
as a vehicle, So you wouldn't have all these parties like Gerindra and so on without direct presidential elections.
Do you mean Gerindra after Prabowo will be the poor party?
No, I would say if there would be and would have been a parliamentary system in Indonesia, they would not have built Gerindra. But before Prabowo was part of Golkar, you maybe would have still be a member of Golkar and would have tried to get to the top within Golkar over time. But he would not, I think it would have been difficult. I mean, why should he build Gerindra if he could not become a president because there are no direct presidential elections? That would be maybe too costly, too expensive, too difficult a strategy. So yeah, I think that means presidentialism is connected to weak party and party system institutionalization. That's, I think, quite clear in the literature. Yeah, so I'm not really a supporter of presidentialism and also of the introduction of presidentialism in Indonesia. I think the perils of presidentialism, according to Juan Linz, are really valid in Indonesia and many other countries, also in the Philippines.
Okay.
And yeah. No, it's okay.
What's that? Oh, okay. So, okay. Jika Bapak-Bapak atau teman-teman komisioner maupun mahasiswa ingin ada yang ditanyakan in bahasa Indonesia tentang pilpres di Filipina dan
you can write in the chat also. No problem.
In the chat. In the other group, my colleague asked me, why you didn't include Indonesia in the direct presidential election? I think in the second page, I think. Yeah.
Okay, that was not my slide. That was from 2002, from a book in 2002.
Oh,
so 2002.
Okay.
So that was the only diagram I could find. I was looking here and there.
In 2002,
No, but Indonesia is included. Yes, that's right.
Okay. Ya, Bu Nurul. Bu Nurul masih on kamera, on webinar. Jadi data 2002, Bu. Tadi.
Yeah, but I think a country has to really decide whether they want a parliamentary system or a presidential system. If they have not made a clear distinction, they will have problems like Indonesia from 1999 until 2004 with the impeachment of Abdurrahman Wahid. It was not clear who has the power and what are the powers of Abdurrahman Wahid. And because of that, there was this infighting and at the end, the impeachment. Yeah, that's often the case. There was this one example. Israel in the 1990s introduced direct elections of the prime minister. And well, at that time, political scientists said that's not possible. Either you have a parliamentary system or a presidential system, but you cannot elect the prime minister directly. And the experiment failed. After 10 years, they went back to the parliamentary system. And in Israel, parties were very much weakened because of that. The prime minister was elected directly, and that means the whole campaign focuses on the prime minister candidates. The parties are not that important any longer, and there was really an effect on the party system and on everything in Israel politics. Another example is France. France introduced a semi-presidential system, I think, in 1958. And again, according to Shugart and Mainwaring, I think. I think that's the book I'm referring to. In France, after 1958, political parties were weakened because of the introduction.
This is a global trend, yeah?
I mean, there are two different strands of literature on presidentialization. There is this Shugart thing that looks at real presidential system where the president is elected directly. There is, according to them, the clear trend that political parties are weakened, like in France, with the introduction of semi-presidentialism. Semi-presidentialism is, in this case, like presidentialism, because Macron is very important, of course, in France. And the prime minister, who's the prime minister? Nobody knows really, in France. Do you know the prime minister in France? No. So it's more like a presidential premier system. And yes, political parties were weakened after 1958. Indonesia is an example. Israel is to an extent an example because the direct election of the prime minister was also a kind of, well, presidential-like system. But there are not many examples because usually countries always use the same system of government. But then there's another strand of literature by Pugundke and Webb on the presidentialization of parties, and they talk about all systems, also parliamentary system. And with presidentialization, they mean, I would say, personalization. Personalities are more important. So even Schröder in Germany or Tony Blair in Britain are examples, according to Pugundke and Webb, of presidentialization. So this is also something you have to have in mind. Many effects of presidentialism or whatever are not really effects of presidentialism because there are other reasons. Maybe populism and the rise of money politics in Indonesia is not the result of the introduction of direct presidential elections, but the result of, according to Pugundke and Webb, a presidentialization of politics. That means there's a rise of campaign costs all over the world because they use professionals, spin doctors, and because you have new media, you need to spend a lot of money for TV and now for campaigning on the internet and so on. And well, there's also, of course, a global weakening of political ideologies. Socialism is maybe not dead, but socialism now is much weaker than in the 1950s or 60s. And well, if you look at Germany, most parties are tending towards the political center. I mean, even the left-wing parties are moderate social democrats, and the right-wing parties like CDU are also centrist parties. That's a phenomenon all over the world. These old ideologies are less attractive than in the 1950s and 60s. And then there's a political vacuum, and this is filled by populist parties who were not well rooted in these old ideological camps, but who come up with a mix of new policy alternatives. So it's very difficult to establish causal relations in this regard.
Oke, adakah Bapak Ibu, baik mahasiswa dan teman-teman mahasiswa mungkin bingung karena pakai bahasa Inggris jadi malu-malu. Nggak apa-apa pakai bahasa Indonesia kalau seandainya malu. Okay, I wanna ask once more, some most politicians in Indonesia and also some NGOs activists promote the simplification of political parties. But for me, it is not a good idea for me. For the simplification, not only not a good idea, but not a good proposal for me. I agree with the multi-party system, like what happens in European countries, what happens in Germany, in Norway, in Netherlands. That's those countries applies multi-party system, with in I don't know, in 2021, because when in 2017 41 political parties in the elections. But I don't know. I'm still confused why politicians and NGO activists promote the simplification become 5 or 3, because Indonesia is a big country, with 7,000 million islands and hundreds of culture. I'm still confused with them. I reject. I don't know. How do you think about their opinion about the simplification of political parties?
At first, I'm a bit surprised that this term simplificasi is used, because there was the simplification in the early 1970s, and that was a tool by Suharto to stifle political parties. So no, I'm also against simplification. That's not a good term. I mean, I'm fond of a multi-party system, because you have many different choices. So okay, you have dozens of parties in Germany, but actually it boils down to 6 or 7: Die Linke, Social Democrats, CDU.
Right now in Germany there are 8 political parties in the parliament.
I'm not sure, 6, 7, 8. I mean, if you see CDU, CSU as one fraction, as one party, then you have Linke, SPD, CDU, Green, Liberal, AfD. I think 6. Then I think 6. But that's okay. I mean, because these parties are quite clear in their policy platforms, and they have a very long tradition, and you know exactly what these people are up to, and I think it's better to have these 6, 7 different parties. And there
Germany,
should be,
with only a narrow culture, has 6 political parties. What about Indonesia with a lot of culture?
Okay. Okay, I think you need a threshold. So in 1999,
of course,
there were so many different parties, and that was, of course, confusing.
Is needed.
Threshold is good.
It's needed, but
so 4 or 5%. That's good. Okay, you don't have local parties in Indonesia. I think that has also be a good decision. If you would have different local parties, it would be a total mess. I don't know. National parties,
And,
so no, simplification is not something I would support. I think you need some other reforms.
Okay.
You need.
But you stand for the simplification
democracy,
or not in the Indonesia?
And not parties dominated.
I mean, you stand
stable now.
Hello? Okay. I mean, do you stand for the simplification or not a simplification?
The connection was a bit unstable, so I did not really understand what you said. Whether I support simplification or not?
That's right. That's right.
No, I don't support simplification. Threshold, yes, but threshold, I would say, is not simplification. I think it's not so bad like now in Indonesia. It's other parties. I mean, not these vehicle parties as working as presidential vehicles. That's not a good development in Indonesian politics. I'm more fond of politics like in the 1950s with 4, 5, 6 parties. Okay, PKI was, of course, anti-democratic, but something like that. I think politics in the 1950s in Indonesia was not so bad. Many people think it was chaotic, but no. I think the democracy in Indonesia in the 1950s was as Sundhausen said, was gambled away by some elite politicians. But actually it was quite stable, and these people were able to build coalition strict laws on financing, and I would say also financing through state subsidies, and need intra-party organization of political parties. And parties can only get state subsidies if criteria. Yeah, they have to be democratic. Yeah, like in Germany, communist
Oke, mungkin ada gangguan sinyal.